So, welcome back, and let's continue talking about qualitative research methods and types by looking at ethnography and case study. Well, first, let's look at case study. So, a case study is really not necessarily a method, but really a choice of how you're going to collect your data, what you're going to study. So, the goal is an in depth exploration and description of something. Here we say bounded system of a case or multiple cases, and they can be across time and across multiple sources of information. So it's not necessarily even just qualitative, but you're looking at a study of something, and you're able to really define the boundaries of what you're studying. The unit of analysis determines this case study. So you might just look at one person or a group of people. Institutions, you might look at your department at your university or one or more universities. So your first step is to purposefully select cases and samples within the case to get your information you want. So if we go to our Happy International Airport Gate, a research question might be, how do airports prepare for international arrivals, such as at Fairbanks International Airport? So we could do it across many airports, or we might just focus a case study on the Fairbanks International Airport. And participants, again, might be people or places or things within the airport. Security agents, stores, restaurants, policymakers, even the people who fly might be part of this study. The sample size could be numerous, and it could be different methods. So you might have interviews with different people, different observations in different places at different times, and they should be associated with that case. The method would be interviews, focus groups, document reviews, observations, surveys, lots of different things. And the result will be this understanding that's very, very comprehensive and rich in description of what the researcher defines as the case. So some examples of case study from the literature. One of them is a case study of a large high school and the tension between educators who believe in schooling for assimilation and those who favor cultural pluralism. So the interest was how the schools functioned as a system in assimilation and accommodation of immigrant students. They were not interested in how individual students were adapting, but they were looking at the system, the case, this case being the schools themselves. So the case was a large urban four-year high school in the United States. And the researchers gained entry into this school by negotiating with the principal that they wanted to do this research. So they had to have entry, which you would have to have if you wanted to go into a school. Data collection was through multiple sources for triangulation, the idea of bringing together different types of research. There was non-participant observation in the classrooms and during lunch, informal discussions with teachers, formal interviews with the principal, a community liaison, community minister, director of a local community center for immigrants, and document data such as school publications, curriculum guides, codes of conduct, and class schedules, and demographics from the community itself where the high school was. The findings were exploratory descriptions of curriculum tracking, bilingual ESL programming, special provisions made by the school, and recommendations came from what they found in this case study. Another example of a case study is on that one person. This is a case study of Jermaine, a gifted Black child living in rural poverty. And the theoretical frame point was critical theory, this idea of transformation, structured examination of the environmental factors influencing education for a gifted child from minority status. The goal was to examine the life of this gifted child living in rural poverty and understand the influence of the environment on academic achievement. So the method of this case study was critical ethnographic research, description to describe the culture. And we'll talk about ethnography in a second. So here, within this case study, they did an ethnography. So the case or the unit of analysis was this child, Jermaine, and it focused on his experiences in his rural environment. Data collection include entree again into his community through a gatekeeper, somebody who allowed and introduced the researchers into the community. Participant observation, where the researcher helped with a reading program and still observed this child. 1 year of correspondence with the teacher and the child, and a visit to the community and in-depth interviews with the child. The analysis was detailed description of the case and context, searching for themes, and they were able to create recommendations for social change for children living in this area. So that's an idea of a case study of one person. Now, ethnography, which was mentioned when we were talking about case study, is a noun and a verb. It is a noun where it's a description of culture or a piece of culture, and a verb where it's the collection of data describing the culture. So if you think about ethnography in terms of methods, it's a method of research and it's a product of the research. You're doing ethnography and what you get is an ethnography. And what I have here written on the slide is ethnography is that the cornerstone of it is culture. So the goal is to describe and interpret culture of a culture or societal group or a system. It involves socio-cultural interpretation. So the interest is not the external, but the internal meanings and processes as described by the researcher. It's to understand interactions of individuals and groups with others within their culture. Researchers examine the group's observable and learn patterns of behavior, customs, and ways of living. So ways that you might do an ethnography might be prolonged observation of the group. So really getting yourself in there, taking field notes or a diary, doing interviews, focus groups with key informants, and maybe even doing some quantitative work, such as in a case study. So ethnography would be a case study of a cultural situation or a cultural, geographically bound area or a culture of some kind of activity. So it can be quantitative in terms of surveys or and archival documents. So the product of the ethnography is data and readable narrative. So you're giving this very thick description and you're incorporating the insider perspective of what you've seen and heard from participants, but the researcher as the outsider interprets the information and gives it back in terms of like taking apart what they're seeing and putting it together in their own interpretation. It's very time consuming, it can be expensive, and it's really not generalizable. But we don't talk about generalization so much in qualitative research. Other people who read the ethnography might say, this applies to my community, this applies to my situation, and therefore I can glean something from this for my situation. So let's think about our airport. In ethnography, a research question could be, what is the culture of the arrival gate when international planes arrive? Participants, again, like before, might be travelers, their families, or others in the setting. The sample size, as in a case study, would be a lot because you're doing different things to understand what is going on in the culture. So you're looking at all these different ways in terms of prolonged observation, field notes, interviews, participants, interviews with participants, and record reviews. And again, the results would be a rich description of the researcher's interpretation of the culture of the international terminal arrival gate. So this is a fun ethnography. I read an article of an ethnography, and it is a gender and power structures in a heavy metal music club. The theoretical underpinning was social constructivist, which we've talked about, with critical theory, looking at race and, no, not looking at race, but looking at the impact of gender. It could be described as a critical or feminist ethnographic case study. It focuses on gendered structures of power in a culture of a heavy metal club. And it took place in Australia. And To prepare for the ethnography, the authors spent over 40 hours observing interactions at this heavy metal club, and they became familiar with this heavy metal scene via magazines, entertainment guides, and listening to the radio to get, to understand the music. They identified codes in terms of the type of heavy metal people, such as metalheads, metal wenches, glam chicks, cool dudes, and hardcore bohemians. And therefore, they knew from this observation who to talk with, who to listen to, who to observe. So the methods involved the researchers took on the role of hardcore bohemians. So one of the types of heavy metal people they observed, so that they could be there and have the ability to collect data without impacting or standing out in this heavy metal club. They did observations of interactions, informal discussions, they took field notes, and they did in-depth interviews. And the analysis was continuous, and they coded for description and themes. And it was really interesting. Where they took their notes was they would observe and then run into the restroom and go in a stall and take and write down their notes as they were writing and learning. So this was a very fun ethnography. So I'm going to take a break here because I'm losing my voice, and we'll end by talking about narratives.